Oftentimes, as we saw with the children yesterday, we can ask ourselves, when does it begin, the change, and also the thinking about biodiversity, sustainability, where does change begin, and who is it actually who matters? Our next keynote speaker says everyone matters. It's Professor Dr. Harald Welzer. He is a social psychologist and well known for his transformation studies. Since 2012, he has been professor of transformation design at the Europa University in Flensburg. And he's also co-founder of the foundation Futur 2, Zukunftsfähigkeit. So talking about the future from a future perspective, how will we have achieved the sustainability goals? And it promotes ideas and practical examples for a livable future for coming generations. He will share with us how change begins and why everyone matters. Big applause, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm very impressed by the 3 talks we heard this morning. And for me, as a social scientist and not one from sciences, it's of course very difficult to say something, and might be something totally different. So, and the interesting thing is that there are 2 different titles for my talk. One is this here, the other one is in the printed volume, and as I never know what I'm going to talk about, this is a beautiful situation, because don't care about the titles, it will be, again, something different. The first thing that I want to talk about is that we have in this type of conferences where all these people come together that want to have a changed situation, that they want transformation because they have this deep knowledge, where we had some kind of additions to this deep knowledge even in this morning. You all have this knowledge and you have all the conviction that it's absolutely necessary to transform our societies, and it is getting even more dangerous, as we learned also in these talks, and as we know from all the climate researches and whatever. And the puzzling thing is that we all want this, but the success is on the other side. And I think that's a bit frustrating, because what we see, at least since a year very intensely, since Donald Trump has become president of the United States again, all these fossil guys, all these capitalist, mega-capitalist, hyper-capitalist guys, all the ones who have a severe interest that is totally different from your interest, are in charge now. And they do what they want to do. And as a social psychologist, for me, it's a really puzzling question. What didn't we realize through all these decades where we were intensifying our research, intensifying our conference issues and things like that? How was it possible that the others took over? This is an interesting question. I think it's really crucial to address these questions on conferences like this, because we tend to have a kind of idealistic concept of society. Idealistic in the sense that as soon as we agree that the world should be better, there's no reason that the world should not be better. So, and this is always the big question, why are things getting worse, although we are also extremely idealistic? The answer is very simple, because we don't live in the Anthropocene, we live in the Capitalocene. We live in the money scene. And there are huge vital interests around the globe that are not identical with your interests. These interests are not about preserving nature. These interests are not preserving all the space for future life of humans and other species. These interests are totally different. These interests are just simply to appropriate What can be appropriated in a given moment? Very simple. And what the problem is that also a number of activities that have been a result of all of our conferences and so are hijacked by these people, which is called greenwashing, or hijacking conferences, huge conferences like the COP conference and whatever. And I think what is absolutely necessary on conferences like this, with people like you, is that we have to become more realistic. We have to adopt political perspectives into our topics, because the world is not an idealistic working world. This is the problem. So the power in the moment and the dynamics, and this is the more theoretically interesting point, the dynamics are on the other side. The dynamics are on the Elon Musk, Donald Trump, whatever asshole side. If I may coin it, not really scientifically, but maybe a scientific investigation would come to the same conclusion. And I think it's really, really important, although it's uncomfortable, to think about the sheer situation that if the dynamics are on the other side, all the aspects that you were brilliantly showing to us will not go better, but worse, because these people who have all the lobbies, who have all the money, and have also, in terms of the United States, the military power, the digital power, and all these things, yeah? And what are the powers that we can use against these kind of, power-based dynamics that are there? And I did a lot of work in my earlier life about war and conflict and changing societies, transformations from democratic societies to dictatorial societies and whatever. So what I'm talking about here now is, of course, non-idealistic, but something where we have to be aware that although we are all very good people, the bad guys are going to win. So, and what does that mean, especially for the coming generations? So I think it's not very appropriate to stay in this idealistic mode, but have to come back to be more political, to find ourselves in a role where there are enemies, and not only people who would say, oh, it's good, yeah? Insect respect is a very good thing. And then the question is, of course, what does it mean for the concrete practices we have? And I think there were some aspects in your talk, Hans, for example, and also in the talk before, where there were these kind of bottom-up approaches, yeah, like going from a different angle. We have one approach that is going to this kind of meta-perspective. Transformation should cover the whole society and the whole world and whatever, and we need big conferences and big volumes and big books and all these things to achieve that. No, this is obviously not working. What we might, and this is something like a thought experiment or something that has not, that has something unusual on the end, maybe it is much more efficient to start where you are. That means to have a focus on the small local practices, on the concrete situations. Because although all these dynamics are on the other side, that doesn't mean, even for democratic societies, that the room to maneuver, the Handlungsraum, as we would say in Germany, is still there on small scales. And maybe we should think about it, because Insect Respect is also a small project, and it started even smaller. And the things that we learned about the urban niches is also a small perspective in some way. And the perspective with the gardens and the gardener movement, maybe why not bringing all these Kleingärtner in the world together, or even in Germany. In Germany, there are many, many Kleingärtners who think they have only a Kleingarten. but maybe if they come together, there must be more impact in it. So these small approaches seem to be counterintuitive, because we are used to these kind of think big, and before we start doing something, capitalism has to be abandoned, the global south has to be freed and whatever, and afterwards we can start to better things. Maybe it's exactly the other way around. And from a psychological point of view, it's also extremely important not to talk about things in the mode of Konjunktiv, man müsste, man könnte, man sollte, but to do something very concretely, because this gives you this feeling as an actor, to be an actor, to be efficient on the level of what you do, while all these conferences leave us in some way in a mode of, yeah, it would be nice if it would be nicer, okay? And there's not this aspect of self-efficacy, that something is happening. And the psychological important thing with this feeling of Selbstwirksamkeit, self-efficacy, is that it's a positive feeling. And as soon as you have had a positive feeling, you want to have more positive feelings. So if you do something, not think, do something on a small scale, the probability is heightened that you will do other steps in the same way. So this is something like a self-fulfilling kind of practice, while only gathering knowledge and thinking about it has no further effect, except having more conferences and having more knowledge and whatever. So, and I absolutely don't want to denunciate these kind of practices. I come from science, not from science, but from humanities. And therefore, I think knowledge, data is okay. But we have to turn, we have to shift, we have to transform our practices itself. Not talking about transformation that others have to do, but also transformation in our concrete practices. Also, as people who are working in the academia. And one concrete example, I was at the Kulturwissenschaftliche Institut at Essen, an advanced study institute for cultural sciences. And at a certain point, maybe like 20 years ago or something, we had the idea to establish something like a Kulturwissenschaftliche Klimaforschung, because climate research was done by 99% by climate researchers, by natural scientists. And the impact of climate change is, of course, a social problem and a cultural problem and a social phenomenon. So therefore, it was a pity that all these other people were so extremely engaged in these topics, but on our side, nobody. So this doesn't make any sense. And there were also no historians, no political scientists, no sociologists, no psychologists at that time. So we wanted to establish something like Kulturwissenschaftliche Klimaforschung. And this was a great success, because everybody said, wow, this is cool, and we can give funding for this because this is something really new, and this is an enterprise and whatever. What was the result of that? We did more conferences. We invited more fellows. We had more workshops. We had more travel expenses and things like that. We published more papers. So we were in the same mode as every problem in this type of society, of capitalist society, is generated. So if we always do more, we are part of the problem. Yeah? And then I dropped out of the whole thing and invented this foundation, Futur 2, because inside the system, in the immanence of the system, you cannot change the things. And the interesting thing, and we had this beautiful movie yesterday, which was in some way a movie about a break of conventional practices, or maybe a paradoxical intervention. So maybe it is worthwhile to think about different strategies, and don't be irritated if people say, oh, this is too small, and this is not going to change the world, and this is not doing anything with a PPM that Mattis was talking about. But maybe all these questions are not so important. Maybe we have to turn to a completely different strategies. That doesn't mean that all these other things can be neglected. Maybe we can do it, and maybe it's important also for political argumentation. But what is much more interesting on many levels is to experiment what can be done in a given situation with the given instruments and powers that we have. And what I really like, even in the current situation, especially in Europe, the populations of the European societies are still, in the majority, very intelligent and good-willing and thinking people. It's not all about right-wing movements. It's not all about whatever negative things. It's not about the total rollback in any respect of climate, of gender, and whatever, you name it. But there are many, many people in all these societies, in Belgium, in Germany, in France, in Denmark, wherever, where the majority is still a majority that wants to keep this type of society. Why? Because this type of society gives them freedom and room to act. Yeah? And it's a frightening perspective that this room is always decreasing, and as in totalitarian states, going to zero. So nobody in the moment, except the complete weird people, want to have something, or the ones who want to run societies and states like that. So this is the part of the interest. The other thing is that there is something still there that we need to address much more. And how can we address all these people? It is something we don't have a pars pro toto solution, but of course many, many different approaches. For example, one approach is what Hans-Dietrich Reckhaus did with his company, because he changed the business model of his company, and that made some material change in his practices, and it made a material change in practices of other companies of his type, and also of the ones who are employed in this company and whatever. So this is something very material. Another example, last week I was on a celebration of Ecosia. Ecosia is a search engine, a small competitor of Google and others, but they use their company for only one goal: to plant trees. And last week there was this celebration because they planted 250 million trees, because they have their search engine and they make money with it and they use it for planting trees. What I find interesting with these kind of approaches is that it's material, it's really concrete. It changes things not on slides, but in given situations. And people are employed there because they need people who are experts in trees and in planting trees, and people who could help and whatever. So you change reality materially. And another point that what we did, this has nothing to do on the first glance with ecological things, but we established a portal, a website called Wohnzimmer der Gesellschaft, Living Rooms of Societies. And this is something where, to my mind, suddenly when I had these many audiences and talking about this and that, I always had the feeling that there are always people who are totally okay. People who come to these kind of events are totally okay. They are not doing shitstorms every day. They are not completely weird. They don't perceive themselves as being completely binary in their thinking, and enemies are all around, and all kinds of theories, but they are quite ordinary, okay people who would make their vote for democratic parties and whatever. But these good people, these democratic people, don't have formats where they can gather, to find themselves together without any kind of formal reason together. What we don't have, maybe in Leuven, because here are so many, it's a student population, and here are so many bars and things like that, so there are many places where you can come together, but on a statistical level, and that sounds ridiculous, but it's really important, we have a decrease of 70% of Kneipen, of bars in Germany. That means bars who were just on the corner, or bars that have been in villages and whatever. They are not existing anymore. And all these institutions, like the fire brigade, like the Jugendrote Kreuz and whatever, these traditional institutions lose numbers, they lose members, and they lose the places where people can meet. These third places, to coin it sociological, Ray Oldenburg, a sociologist, who coined the term third places, because we always exist in two places, as private persons in the family and as professionals in our jobs. So these are roles that are totally fixed. Third places offer something totally different, places where you can go and are not dependent on your role, who you are, what you do, whatever, because you can meet, you can talk, you can have a beer, or whatever, and this is a very, very important social institution, these third places. But we are losing them because of all this digital communication and things like that. And to reinvent social situations and these kind of Wohnzimmer der Gesellschaft is a format where the people who want to preserve this type of society can meet on occasions, whatever. They can read together, they can drink together, whatever. So the idea was that this is an important thing. And then we learned that in Germany, many of these informal living rooms are already existing. And now we have this kind of portal, and we have 500, more than 500 within 2.5 months, where people would say, we do something like this in our village or in the city or in this part of the city or whatever. So this is an indicator that there is a potential, and the only thing is that we don't offer formats for this potential. And then, coming back to our issue, and this is mainly socio-ecological transformation, it would be something to offer practical rooms, practical spaces where people can do something, really doing together with some kind of sense, and where this probability of establishing a feeling of self-efficacy and that not everything is doom outside there is something that has positive outcomes on a social but also on a transformative level in terms of these ecological problems. And thinking about that, I would strongly vote for two things. And maybe we can discuss about it. The one thing is the repoliticization of what we do as environmental thinkers, environmental activists, and whatever. To turn back from this idea, our only problem is committing knowledge. This is not our problem. The problem is that we live in a world where people want to hijack this world, and they are very successful in it, for their interests that are different from other interests. Repoliticization. We have to identify ourselves not only as the ones with the better ideas, but also to re-identify ourselves as the ones who want to preserve these societies and therefore have enemies who want to destroy this type of society. And my emphasis on society is really crucial, because all the efforts that are done in research and in presentations like we heard this morning is only possible in the frame of open democratic societies. This is something we have to really realize, and we see in the moment, in real time and in color, what is happening in the United States, especially with kind of scientific data and science in sich, yeah? That we have an anti-intellectual and scientific approach, which is always part of a transformation into authoritarian societies. Therefore, society is crucial, politics are crucial, and then the feeling of being able to change things on a very concrete level. So in some way, my idea is to be more realistic, become more realistic, finally, after 40 or 50 years of these environmental studies, to become more realistic, to become more political, to become more aware of the enemies. And then maybe it's also worthwhile, and we talked about this yesterday evening after watching this movie, the beginning of the environmental movement in the 1960s and in the 1970s was not about CO2. It was not about so detailed impacts of things that we know from scientific data. It was about changing society. Because these people, and you can look at Ivan Illich or others, and also Dennis Meadows, yeah, the always mentioned limits to growth thing. Dennis Meadows and his team were very, very sociological thinking persons. It was not about the climate, it was not about the environment, it was about the society, yeah? And that it's necessary to change parameters. So from Capitalocene, maybe back to Anthropocene, where people, humans, do the right things to preserve the future conditions of survival and things like that. And it's quite interesting to think about the aesthetics of protest that were beginning with the beginning of the environmental movement. Think about Greenpeace. Greenpeace was successful not because they produced beautiful PowerPoint presentations, but they were successful because they did concrete action with a certain type of aesthetics, you know, a small boat against the big whale trawler, and things like that. So they were using narrative forms, because this is a really classical narrative, David versus Goliath. Yeah? And David is able to win. And all these things, you know, like action that is interesting, fascinating, that can be communicated by pictures and films, like climbing up chimneys and things like that. And there were many, many of these approaches, even in popular culture. Think about John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and persons like that, who had also these topics that we are discussing about. But they were able to address society. They were able to develop pictures, frames where people could imagine something. So, and maybe with these few suggestions, I didn't address my topic at all. Hope you realized it, but that's how it is. Thank you.